I never thought a simple extension cord would turn my life upside down. But when my HOA leader, Carl, accused me of stealing power from the community and slapped me with a ridiculous fine, I knew I had to fight back. What started as a petty accusation quickly spiraled into a battle of egos, corruption, and a revenge so perfect that it destroyed Carl's entire career. Living in an HOA community was supposed to be simple. Follow the rules, keep your yard neat, and don't make trouble. But Carl, the HOA president, ran our neighborhood like he was some kind of dictator. He'd fine people for the smallest infractions. Grass, too long? $50, fine. Trash can out an hour too early? Another $50. He loved control, and he especially loved making people miserable. One evening, I ran an extension cord from my garage to my backyard to power some string lights for a small get-together. It was a quiet evening, nothing crazy, just a few friends enjoying some drinks. The next morning, I woke up to a bright orange violation notice taped to my front door. Carl had fined me $500 for illegally siphoning power from the HOA. Stared at the paper, completely dumbfounded. What the hell was he talking about? I wasn't stealing power. I was using my own damn electricity. Furious, I marched to Carl's house, which, of course, was the biggest one in the neighborhood, bought with the thousands of dollars in fines he'd been collecting from residents. When he answered the door, he smirked like he had been expecting me. "You can't run an extension cord across the lawn," he said. "It's considered unauthorized power usage." "That's my power, Carl, from my own house," I shot back. "Doesn't matter," he said with a shrug. "The rules clearly state that all electrical setups must be HOA approved. Pay the fine, or we'll escalate this." Now, at this point, I could have just paid the fine and moved on. But something about Carl's cocky grin set me off. This wasn't about a rule. It was about control. He wanted me to fight back because he thought he'd win. And that's when I started digging. I talked to my neighbors, some of whom had been hit with even bigger fines for nonsense violations. One woman got charged $750 because her garden gnome was too distracting. Another guy had to pay $1,000 because his front door was the wrong shade of beige. People had been complaining for years, but Carl always found a way to keep them quiet. The deeper I looked, the worse it got. Turns out, Carl had been pocketing a good chunk of the HOA's money. Fines that were supposed to go toward community improvements were mysteriously vanishing. And then I found the smoking gun. Carl had approved contracts with companies owned by his own family, funneling HOA money straight into his pockets. It wasn't just unethical. It was illegal. I knew I had him, but I couldn't just expose him. I needed to make it hurt. I wasn't going to let Carl win. Not only had he fined me for something ridiculous, but he had been stealing from the entire neighborhood for years. If I was going to take him down, I needed to be smart about it. First, I started gathering proof. I requested the HOA's financial records under the Freedom of Information Act, which Carl tried to fight, but since HOAs operate as non-profits, the records had to be available upon request. When I finally got my hands on them, the numbers were a complete mess. Tens of thousands of dollars were listed under general expenses with no explanations. Then I dug into Carl's personal finances. With the help of a friend who worked in real estate, I found that Carl had recently bought a lake house and a brand new luxury SUV. That wouldn't be a problem if his only source of income wasn't his modest HOA salary. The final piece of the puzzle? I found 3 companies that had contracts with the HOA for things like landscaping, maintenance, and security. All of them were owned by Carl's relatives, and the prices they charged were outrageously high compared to market rates. At this point, I had enough to bring him down, but I needed to make sure he wouldn't be able to talk his way out of it. I started quietly talking to my neighbors, people who had been fined for ridiculous reasons, those who had complained but been ignored. I showed them the proof. Word spread like wildfire. Soon, we had a group of over 30 homeowners who were ready to fight back. The next step, a special HOA meeting. We requested a formal meeting with the board, citing financial concerns. Carl, thinking he was untouchable, agreed, probably assuming he could talk his way out of it like he always did. The night of the meeting, the clubhouse was packed. Carl walked in, wearing his usual smug expression, but for the first time, there was tension in the air. People whispered, shot him dirty looks. He noticed, but he still had no idea what was coming. I stood up first. I calmly laid out my findings: the fake contracts, the missing money, the personal spending that didn't match his income. Every time I presented a new piece of evidence, the room got louder. Carl's face went from cocky to pale. Then, the bombshell. I had already sent everything to the state attorney general's office. The room erupted. People started yelling, demanding resignations, calling him a thief. Carl tried to defend himself, but no one was listening anymore. That's when someone called the police. Carl knew he was done. He tried to leave, but the moment he stepped outside, he was met with flashing lights and uniformed officers. Carl stood, frozen as the flashing lights painted his face in shades of red and blue. Two uniformed officers approached, their hands resting on their belts, and the entire neighborhood fell into a stunned silence. The man who had spent years lording over us with fines, threats, and corruption was about to face some real consequences. But here's the thing, Carl wasn't stupid. He had lawyered up the moment I started digging. He knew the police wouldn't arrest him on the spot unless they had a solid case. And unfortunately, while my evidence was enough to ruin his reputation, it wasn't quite enough to put handcuffs on him. Yet, the officers questioned him in front of everyone. They asked about the missing HOA funds, the suspicious contracts, and the exorbitant personal purchases. Carl, still trying to play it cool, smirked and said it was all a misunderstanding. The board approved every expense, he said, acting innocent. That's when one of the officers turned to me. Do you have proof that these payments were unauthorized? I felt my stomach drop. I had proof of mismanagement and fraud, but if Carl could convince them that the HOA board had knowingly signed off on these expenses, then it wasn't technically theft. It was just gross incompetence. I needed more. So, I played my final card. I need access to the HOA email records, I said. I believe Carl has been forging board approvals. Carl's smug expression cracked for the first time. The police couldn't seize private HOA emails without a subpoena, but the homeowners could request them. And since the majority of the board members were at the meeting and were just now realizing they had been used as scapegoats, they agreed to give me full access. That night, I went through hundreds of emails. And then, I found it. Carl had photoshopped board member signatures on financial approvals. He had been denying refund requests from homeowners while writing himself checks from HOA funds. He even pressured vendors to inflate their prices, then demanded a cut of the overcharge. But the real kicker, Carl had already transferred a massive sum of HOA funds to a private offshore account. I sent everything to the state attorney general's office, and within a week, Carl's world came crashing down. He was officially charged with fraud, embezzlement, and wire fraud, since some of his stolen funds had crossed state lines. Federal charges. He was looking at serious time behind bars. But I wasn't done yet. I had one more move to make. Carl tried to run. The moment he realized just how deep he was, he resigned from the HOA, listed his house for sale, and vanished. But he wasn't as smart as he thought. His accounts were being monitored, and his assets were frozen the second the charges were filed. I'll never forget the day they dragged him out in handcuffs. It was early morning when the FBI showed up at his house. A group of us, his former victims, stood on the sidewalk watching as they knocked on his door. When Carl stepped out, he was in sweatpants and a wrinkled t-shirt, looking like he hadn't slept in days. An agent read him his rights as they cuffed his hands behind his back. His face was a mix of rage and pure panic. And then, as if to make it all even sweeter, Carl saw me standing in the crowd. His eyes locked onto mine, and for the first time, he knew. He knew that I had been the one to bring him down. But here's where it gets even better. During the investigation, the feds uncovered that Carl hadn't just been stealing from the HOA. He had been committing fraud for years. He had done the same thing in 2 other neighborhoods before ours, each time taking off before anyone could catch him. This time, he wasn't getting away. His trial was a public spectacle. The prosecution laid out everything: the fake contracts, the forged documents, the stolen money, and the offshore account he had tried to access before his arrest. The judge wasn't amused. Carl was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison, with no chance of parole for at least 8 years. His assets? Seized. His brand-new luxury SUV? Auctioned off. His lake house? Gone. And the HOA? Well, after Carl's arrest, we voted to completely dissolve it. No more ridiculous fines. No more corruption. No more power-hungry tyrants. It was over. But I had one last surprise for Carl. Using the money that was recovered from his stolen funds, we decided to throw a massive neighborhood party, the kind Carl would have hated. Loud music, colorful decorations, people actually having fun, and, just to be extra petty, I printed out Carl's mugshot and used it as the centerpiece for the drinks table. As we raised our glasses, someone asked, "Do you think Carl's thinking about us right now?" I smirked. "Oh, I guarantee it." Carl's downfall became legendary in our town. For months, people couldn't stop talking about how the once untouchable HOA tyrant had ended up in federal prison. Every time his name came up, someone had a new ridiculous fine or petty rule he had enforced. And we all laughed, knowing he was now rotting in a tiny cell with no power over anyone. But the real justice? That came later. One day, I got a letter in the mail. It was from the State Restitution Board, informing me that, as one of the victims in Carl's case, I was entitled to compensation. Carl had been ordered to pay back every single homeowner he had stolen from. Of course, since he was broke and his assets had been seized, his only way to pay was through prison labor. That's right. Carl was working behind bars for pennies an hour, and every cent was being sent directly to the people he had wronged. I couldn't stop laughing. The man who had fined me $500 for an extension cord was now literally working to pay me back. But it got even better. A few months later, I got an email from a reporter. Carl's case had gained national attention, and a news outlet was doing a segment on corrupt HOAs and fraudulent presidents. They wanted to interview me. Of course, I said yes. The story aired on a major network, detailing everything: the fake fines, the stolen money, the offshore accounts, and Carl's pathetic attempt to flee. They even showed his mugshot on screen, side by side with a picture of his old HOA president badge. Carl's family saw the story. Apparently, they had no idea how deep his corruption ran. His wife divorced him, his kids refused to visit him, and his siblings disowned him. The man who had controlled an entire neighborhood was now completely alone. But my absolute favorite part? One of my neighbors, an older guy named Frank, decided to visit Carl in prison. Not because he felt sorry for him, but because he wanted to see the look on Carl's face when he realized he had lost everything. Frank later told me that when Carl saw him, he turned pale and tried to walk away. Frank just smiled and said, "Oh no, buddy. You can't find me for being here." I wish I could have seen it myself. At the end of the day, Carl got exactly what he deserved. The HOA was gone, the neighborhood was thriving, and every single person he had screwed over was now enjoying life without his nonsense rules. And as for me, every time I see an extension cord, I smile, because sometimes revenge is just that sweet.